Something just happened in Iran, and at first, almost nobody paid attention. It didn't look like a breaking headline. There were no dramatic speeches, no official declarations that would instantly grab global attention. But behind the scenes, something very unusual started unfolding. And analysts who follow the region closely began to notice small details that didn't quite fit the pattern. Because here's the reality. Iran operates in very predictable ways when it comes to geopolitical pressure. There are signals, there are warnings, there are escalations, but they usually follow a rhythm. This time, that rhythm was broken, and that's what made people nervous. Over the past weeks, tensions around Iran have already been building. Sanctions pressure remains high. The nuclear program is once again under intense scrutiny. And the strategic importance of the region, especially the Strait of Hormuz, where nearly 20% of the world's oil passes, makes every move incredibly sensitive. Any disruption there doesn't just affect one country, it affects the entire global economy. Oil prices, shipping routes, energy stability, everything is connected. Now here's where it gets interesting. Instead of reacting loudly, instead of making bold public statements, Iran's recent move was subtle, calculated, and most importantly, unexpected in its timing. According to multiple regional observers, activity patterns shifted. Movements that are usually spaced out happened closer together. Signals that are normally clear became harder to interpret. And that raises a serious question. Was this intentional? Because when a country like Iran changes its behavior, it's rarely accidental. There is usually a message behind it, but this time the message isn't obvious, and that's what makes it more dangerous. Some analysts believe this could be a strategic repositioning. Others think it's a response to pressure happening quietly behind closed doors, negotiations, intelligence activity, or even preparations that haven't been publicly revealed yet. And then there's a third possibility, that this is not a reaction at all, but the beginning of something new, something pre-planned. Because timing in geopolitics is never random. And right now, the timing is what's raising the most concern. Global attention is divided. Major powers are focused on multiple crises at once. And in moments like this, when the world is distracted, unexpected moves become more likely. History has shown this again and again. The biggest shifts don't happen when everyone is watching. They happen when no one is fully paying attention. And that's exactly why this situation is starting to stand out. Because while headlines may still look normal, underneath, something is changing. Quietly, gradually, but very deliberately. And the people who are watching closely, they're not reacting with panic, they're reacting with caution, which is often a much stronger signal. Because panic is loud, caution is silent. It means something is being taken seriously, even if it hasn't been explained yet. So now we're left with a situation where we know something changed, we know it wasn't typical, and we know the timing is unusual, but we still don't fully know why. And that uncertainty is what makes this story so important. Because once the reason becomes clear, the consequences usually follow very quickly. So the real question is not just what happened. The real question is, what is this leading to? Because if this is just a small shift, it will fade away. But if it's the first step of something bigger, then what we're seeing right now is only the beginning. In the next part, we're going to break down exactly what triggered this situation, and why experts believe this could escalate faster than expected. To understand what's really happening, we need to go back just a little. Because this didn't start today. It's been building quietly for weeks. Behind diplomatic language and routine headlines, pressure around Iran has been increasing. Talks over its nuclear program have stalled again. International inspectors have raised concerns about uranium enrichment levels reaching higher thresholds. And at the same time, economic pressure hasn't eased. Sanctions are still hitting key sectors. But here's the part most people missed. While all of that was happening, Iran didn't respond the way it usually does. There were no major public escalations, no dramatic announcements. Instead, there was silence. And in geopolitics, silence can be more meaningful than noise. Because during that silence, something else was happening. Regional monitoring groups and open source intelligence analysts began tracking subtle changes, increased logistical movement in certain areas, more coordinated patterns in transportation routes, and activity that suggested preparation, not reaction. None of this was officially confirmed. But when multiple independent observers start seeing the same patterns, it's no longer coincidence, it's a signal. And then, something even more unusual happened. Shipping data around the Persian Gulf started showing irregularities. Nothing that would immediately trigger global alarms, but enough to raise eyebrows among analysts. Some routes became less predictable, certain movements slowed down, while others sped up unexpectedly. And all of this was happening near one of the most critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage is responsible for nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply. Any disruption there can ripple across global markets within hours, and that's exactly why experts started paying attention. because when activity changes in that region, it's never random. At the same time, satellite observations, the kind used by independent analysts, began to show shifts in positioning. Again, nothing explosive, nothing that would make headlines, but enough to suggest that something was being adjusted, carefully, step by step. And here's where things take a more serious turn, because when you combine all these small signals together, the silence, the timing, the movement patterns, the strategic location, it starts to form a much bigger picture. A picture that doesn't look reactive. It looks intentional. Some experts now believe that Iran may be testing responses, not through direct confrontation, but through controlled, calculated changes, almost like probing the system, seeing how others react, how quickly they notice, how seriously they respond. And that kind of strategy is very different from open escalation. It's quieter, but in many ways, more dangerous, because it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is what destabilizes regions the fastest. Reports began to circulate that certain actions were happening without clear attribution. In other words, things were moving, but it wasn't obvious who was responsible. Because when responsibility is unclear, reactions become harder to control. Misinterpretations happen. Overreactions become more likely, and small incidents can escalate very quickly. We've seen this before in history. Moments where confusion led to consequences far bigger than anyone intended. And that's exactly what analysts are worried about right now. Not just what is happening, but how it might be interpreted. In a region, this sensitive perception can be just as powerful as reality. And if multiple sides start reading the situation differently, things can spiral fast. Activity has changed. Signals are unclear. Is this still controlled, or is it already slipping into something unpredictable? Because if it's controlled, then this is strategy. But if it's not, then we could be looking at the early stages of something much harder to contain. Global powers are responding behind the scenes. On the surface, the response has been calm. Measured statements, carefully chosen words. But behind that calm tone, there are signs of increased attention. If you know where to look, those signs are hard to ignore. In the US, military analysts point out a subtle shift. More surveillance flights and increased tracking of maritime movement. Global markets have started reacting, but in a controlled way. Oil prices have shown sensitivity. Traders are watching closely. Diplomatic activity has quietly increased. Meetings behind closed doors. Conversations that don't make headlines but matter far more. Containment only works when everyone understands what's happening. Right now, that clarity doesn't fully exist. Regional players in the Middle East feel these shifts. Security readiness levels change, quietly, gradually. Everything is moving, but nothing is being openly confirmed. The kind of tension where no one wants to say it out loud can change everything. So now we're entering a phase where awareness is high, clarity is low, and reactions are becoming more sensitive. And in situations like this, it doesn't take a major event to trigger escalation. Sometimes, all it takes is a misunderstanding. And in the next part, we're going to explore the possible scenarios, what could actually happen next, and which outcome experts are quietly most concerned about. So now we arrive at the most critical part of this entire situation. What happens next? Because up to this point, everything we've seen has been signals, subtle changes, quiet reactions, unusual timing. But signals always lead somewhere. And experts are now focusing on a few possible scenarios. Not predictions, but realistic paths this situation could take. And each one carries very different consequences. Let's start with the first scenario, the controlled outcome. In this version, everything we're seeing right now is intentional, but limited. A strategic move designed to send a message, to test reactions, or to apply pressure, to shift positioning without crossing a red line. If that's the case, then what happens next is de-escalation, gradual normalization, a return to predictable patterns, and behind-the-scenes agreements that prevent things from going further. This is the scenario governments hope for, because it keeps everything contained. But here's the problem. This kind of control requires precision. Every side has to interpret the signals correctly. Every response has to be measured, and there's very little room for error. Which brings us to the second scenario, miscalculation. Not intentional escalation, but a misunderstanding. One side interprets a signal differently, another responds more aggressively than expected. And suddenly, what was meant to be controlled starts to move on its own. This is where things become dangerous. Because once reactions start feeding into each other, control becomes harder to maintain. And history has shown us that many major conflicts didn't start with a clear decision. They started with confusion, with misread intentions, with one move triggering another, and another, until it was too late to stop. Now here's the third scenario, the one that analysts are the most cautious about discussing. Gradual escalation, not sudden, not explosive, but step by step. Small actions that don't seem major on their own, but together begin to shift the entire balance. In this scenario, we wouldn't see a single dramatic event. We would see a sequence, increased pressure on key routes, more aggressive positioning, economic signals starting to tighten, and one of the biggest areas to watch here is energy. Because if this situation begins to affect the flow of oil, even slightly, the impact won't stay regional. It will go global, prices would react, supply chains would feel it, and economic pressure would spread far beyond the Middle East. And that's what makes this scenario so powerful. It doesn't need a headline moment. The effects speak for themselves. Now there's one more possibility, a strategic shift, something larger than a short-term reaction, a repositioning that signals a change in long-term direction. And if that's what we're seeing, then this moment is not just about tension. It's about transformation, a shift in how power is projected, how influence is applied, and how future conflicts might unfold. But here's the truth. Right now, we don't know which of these scenarios is unfolding, and that uncertainty is exactly what's keeping experts on edge. Because each scenario starts the same way, with subtle signals, with unclear intentions, and with movements that don't fully explain themselves. And that's exactly where we are right now. At the beginning of something, but without a clear ending. So the question is no longer, did something unusual happen? That part is already clear. The real question is, which path are we on? Because once that becomes obvious, the window to react becomes much smaller. And in the final part, we're going to break down what this means for the world and why this moment might be more important than it seems. So where does all of this leave us? After everything we've just broken down, the signals, the reactions, the possible scenarios, we're left with something that is both simple and unsettling at the same time. Something has changed, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that's subtle enough to go unnoticed and serious enough to matter. And moments like this don't always look important at first. In fact, most people only recognize them later, when the consequences are already visible, when headlines become clearer, when reactions become stronger, when uncertainty turns into reality. But right now, we're still in that early phase, the phase where things are forming, but not fully revealed. And that's exactly why this moment is so important to understand. Because if you zoom out for a second, this isn't just about Iran. It's about how quickly situations can shift in today's world, how interconnected everything has become. A movement in one region can affect energy prices across continents. A decision behind closed doors can influence markets, stability, and security far beyond its origin. And that means this isn't a distant story. It's a connected one. Now, to be clear, this doesn't automatically mean a crisis is inevitable. It doesn't mean the worst-case scenario will happen. But it does mean one thing. We are in a moment of uncertainty. And uncertainty is always a turning point. It's the stage where different outcomes are still possible, where things can stabilize or move in a completely different direction. And what happens next will depend on how these signals are interpreted, how decisions are made, and how quickly situations evolve. Because as we've seen in the past, the difference between stability and escalation is often found in the earliest, most subtle signals, is often just a series of small steps. Steps that don't seem significant on their own, but together change everything. So if there's one takeaway from all of this, it's this. Don't just watch the headlines, watch the patterns. Because the real story is rarely in a single event. It's in how events connect, how they build, and how they lead into what comes next. Right now, we're watching the early stages of something that could go in multiple directions. Maybe it stabilizes, maybe it fades, or maybe this is the beginning of a much bigger shift. And the truth is, we won't fully understand it until the next move is made. So the question is no longer, what just happened? The real question now is, what happens next? Because whatever that answer is, it won't stay contained for long. And if you've made it this far, I'm curious, do you think the situation will calm down, or are we at the start of something bigger? Let me know what you think. Because sometimes the smartest insights come from the people who are paying attention early.